Yeah. Shit, Dad, I hear you. Mark Shaw lifted his son off the computer console and then slammed him back down. Say the fucking words, Anthony. Say you will not change your name. I won't. Christ, Dad, I won't change my name. You have a good name, Anthony. An honorable name. Yeah, an honorable name. Dad, I get it. Out in the hallway, the moaning was getting louder. Mark Shaw looked up and listened. He thought he could hear 2, maybe 3 of those zombies out there. Then he looked down at the terror on Anthony's face, and for a moment was shocked and a little frightened with the violence he knew he carried around inside himself. He let go of his son and backed away. Anthony slid off the console and stood staring at his father, his expression a mixture of resentment and fear that made him seem 10 years younger, almost childlike. Listen to me, Anthony. I want you to go and get your brother. Go and get that money. When you have it, you come straight back here, you hear me? Live or die, I will do everything in my power to get these people out of danger. And I will make sure the name you and your brother carry out of the city is one you will never, ever think of changing. Is that clear? Anthony tugged his shirt down at the waist to straighten it. Yeah, that's clear. Good. Now go and find your brother. The moaning was extremely close now. Both men could hear the zombies splashing out in the hallway. I'll take care of those first, Anthony said. No, Mark Shaw said, drawing his weapon. We'll take care of it together. Chapter 10. Eleanor stopped at her front door and stared at the water flowing through her dining room, her living room, out the broken windows along the back wall, momentarily stunned by it. The sight was completely insane, yet strangely beautiful. Eleanor, you okay? Jim asked. Yeah, she said, mentally shaking herself loose. I'm coming. She followed Jim and Madison out the front door. She tossed her Mossberg into the canoe they'd tied to the front porch, then helped Jim with their backpacks. Next, she reached down to help Madison up into the canoe, but when she tried to lift her, the girl shrugged her hands away. Madison? Eleanor said. Madison wouldn't look at her. She turned away from Eleanor and held her hands up to Jim, the same way she'd done when she was 3 and begging Daddy to carry her off to bed. Jim glanced from Madison to Eleanor, and she saw surprise there in his expression. Whatever was going on with Madison, it was news to him as well. He bent down and scooped her into the boat without saying a word to Madison, not even scolding her with a look, and Eleanor was thankful for that. Now was not the time. Go ahead, he said to Eleanor. He was nodding toward the boat, holding its sides to steady it for her. She climbed in, then leaned forward and touched the back of Madison's shoulder. Madison? Sweetheart? But Madison pulled her shoulder away again. Don't, she said, without turning around, and scooted forward on the bench and hunched her shoulders forward. Eleanor could almost see her crawling into herself. Eleanor glanced at Jim for some clue, some sort of help, but all he could do was shrug. They moved away from the house, Jim and Eleanor paddling, Madison still silent and distant in the front of the canoe. The air was unbearably humid. A slight breeze blew from the south, but it wasn't enough to chase away the mosquitoes, and it wasn't enough to cool the heat on the backs of their necks. Eleanor was drenched in sweat, hot and irritable, and exhausted beyond measure. She took it out on the mosquitoes. Just in the last few minutes they'd gotten terrible, practically swarming the canoe. She killed the big one on her arm, her face crinkling in disgust at its smashed body and the smear of blood in which it lay. Then she looked forward and saw Jim and Madison both swatting frantically at the bugs. "I've got some bug repellent," she said. "Thank God," Jim said. "Let me have some. These little bastards are eating me alive up here." She pulled in her oar and got the combination bug repellent and sunscreen from her backpack. As far as getting her family prepared for this disaster, the backpacks had really been her crowning achievement. Making them was strangely satisfying, much like preparing Madison's nursery had been in the months before she was born. Eleanor had stockpiled water and food and supplies, just like the guidebook said to do. But all of that was lost back in their house. The backpacks, on the other hand, went wherever they were needed. Each one was basically a turtle shell, a house carried on the back. She had planned the contents of each, packed them, reconsidered, reorganized, and repacked them. Then she'd weighed each and repacked them a third time, each containing a complete 96-hour survival kit, everything the wearer would need to get by for at least 4 days. But Eleanor had gone beyond those basic needs, and that was what really made her proud. She'd had dog tags made for each of them. She'd included family photographs in case they got separated, cash for each of them, a 3-month supply of Jim's Diaban for his blood pressure, even a carton of Marlboro cigarettes for each of them. "You want me to start smoking?" Madison had said, holding up the cigarettes. "Of course not, you goof," she'd said, stroking Madison's hair out of her face, secretly delighted with the look of disgust on her daughter's face. "They're for you to use as currency. Just in case, mind you. You never know what people will do if they want to smoke bad enough." Madison scrunched up her nose in that uniquely teenager way of expressing complete revulsion with the world of grown-ups. "That's gross," she said, and tossed the Marlboros back in the front pocket of her pack. But Jim's medicine had been her greatest coup. The city's insurance had given her hell about buying a 3-month supply of Diaban, and she'd given it right back to them. "Why," she argued, "do you train me in disaster preparedness, a basic tenet of which makes it plain that you should have a long-term supply of prescription drugs on hand at all times, and then tell me that I can only buy 30 days at a time?" In the end, it had been the pharmacy that finally gave in. "You want a 3-month supply?" they'd said. "Fine, but you have to buy it on your own. Your insurance won't budge." She'd paid the extra money, and at the time had been aware of how paranoid she must have seemed. But she certainly didn't feel silly about it right now. Glancing around at the submerged houses, the traffic lights dipping like low-hanging fruit toward the floodwaters, she was feeling anything but silly. As a matter of fact, she was basking in the righteous glow of vindication. "Hey, Eleanor," Jim said. "You got that bug spray or what?" His voice snapped her back into the moment. She had her hand jammed down into her backpack, and it occurred to her that she had no idea how long she'd been sitting there like that. "Here it is," she said, and tossed it up to him. "Madison, you need to put some on too, okay?" Madison said nothing. She hadn't moved since they'd left the house, except to swat at a mosquito or two. Her shoulders were still sagging forward, her brown hair covering her face like a curtain. Eleanor watched the gentle rise and fall of her body under her shirt as she breathed, and she was pretty sure Madison was sobbing. Jim put his hand on Madison's knee and gave it a gentle shake. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" Madison suddenly lunged forward and buried her face in Jim's chest. "Hey," he said, his eyes going wide with momentary surprise. "You're okay, sweetheart. We all are." He gave Eleanor a perplexed look. "Hey, what am I supposed to do now?" look, and then finally put his arm around her and let her cry. Over the past 2 weeks, Eleanor had made countless canoe trips between her house and the EOC. It usually took about 3 hours to make it one way. But that was before cannibals started appearing in the ruins. Now, as they paddled their way toward the EOC, they'd see dim figures moving through the endless piles of wrecked houses and jumbled piles of vehicles, stepping out from between the eaves of houses, staggering toward them, and always ceaselessly moaning. There were only a few at first, But as Eleanor and her family moved north, gliding through the debris fields, they saw more and more people staggering around aimlessly, stumbling after them whenever the canoe got too close. The residential areas were the worst. In some places, the moaning was so loud, so disconcerting, that Madison had screamed, her hands clapped over her ears until she broke down sobbing. Eleanor and Jim rarely spoke. A hush fell over them, and it seemed dangerous somehow to speak. They watched the people who crashed out of the doorways and stared at them as they floated by, and though it was impossible to know whether they were changed in the same way that Bobby Hester had been changed, that Miss Hester, too, had been changed, Eleanor reminded herself. She'd hear them moan, and the hairs would stand up on the back of her neck none the less. And so Eleanor and her family kept moving east, off their intended course, away from the dead eyes staring back at them from the ruins. It still seemed ludicrous to her that she was being forced to avoid cannibalism that was, for all intents and purposes, contagious. But there it was. And here they were, getting farther and farther off course. Jim pushed the floating dead man away from the canoe, his paddle slipping off the man's shoulder and striking his skull right behind the ear with a wet thud. "Ew!" Madison groaned. They had seen quite a few bodies in the last hour or so. They'd seen a lot of dead dogs, and rats, and cats, and raccoons, and even a big brown cow. Death, in fact, was all around them. They were coming up through the second ward now, and a lot of the houses here had fared badly during Mardell's storm surge. In some places they'd actually been uprooted from the ground and tossed together, one on top of another, like football players going for a fumble. In some of the houses, Eleanor could hear dogs howling out their hunger and their fear. But the wailing of animals wasn't the only sound they heard. Here and there, amid the rubble, they could hear the voices of people, weak and muffled, but still insistent, as they cried out for rescue. And there was another sound, too, a thin, solitary moaning that was not one of pain or loneliness or despair, but something else. Something that sent a bone-deep shudder through Eleanor's body and raised the goose-flesh on her arms. Eleanor scanned the ruined houses and saw nothing but bodies floating face down in the water, their backs matted with wet garbage. "Why?" Madison said. Her voice was small and remote, almost a whisper. "What did you say, baby?" Eleanor asked her. Madison was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought her daughter would fall back into another of her spells, in which there was no reaching her. But then Madison spoke. And when she did, it was with such rage, such sudden violence, that Eleanor recoiled from her, much in the same way she had recoiled from the snarling, wounded thing that Miss Hester had become. "Why did it have to happen to her? What purpose did that serve?" Eleanor's eyes went wide. The little girl in front of her suddenly looked nothing like her daughter. Her lips were pulled back in anger, exposing large white teeth. Her cheeks puffed in and out, keeping time with the rise and fall of her tiny, nearly breastless chest. But it was the look of offended rage in the girl's eyes that caused Eleanor's throat to go hard as slate, and her heart to skip its beat. "Why, Mom? Why did that happen? Why did it happen to her?" All Eleanor could do was shake her head. "I don't know," she said miserably. "I'm sorry, baby, I just don't know." And for the next 24 hours she'd be recalling her daughter's questions, and still struggling for an answer that made any sense at all. They came to a high white wall of painted cinder blocks that looked to run a couple 100 feet in either direction. Thick drifts of dead seaweed and trash and tree limbs were wedged up against the wall. In the front of the canoe, Jim sat looking at the wall, the oar across his lap. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, the back of his neck black with wet dirt. He turned back to Eleanor and said, "Well, which way?" Eleanor had a compass and a map in her backpack, but she hadn't needed it yet. Despite the fact that so much of the city was under water now, there were still obvious landmarks to guide them. And besides, she'd been a beat cop for a good 6 years. She knew her way around the city, even as it was now. "I don't see that it really matters," she said. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. "Exactly." "Okay, got a preference? Which feels lucky?" He gave her a little wink with that last part. A private joke between them from back in the days when Madison was much younger, and Jim and Eleanor could still make coded jokes about slipping off to the bedroom for a quickie, even while Madison sat in the living room watching cartoons. She snorted at him. "Neither one looks lucky," she said. He pretended to look hurt. "Go left," she said, and laughed at him quietly. "You know," she thought, as the laugh trailed off and became a smile, "he's still pretty cute. A little bit chubbier than when I married him, but then so am I." She watched the muscles along his back move under his shirt as he used the oar to get them pointed in the right direction, his shoulders dipping powerfully, first one way, then the other, as he plunged the oar into the water. And she was surprised by the warmth spreading over her skin. "Who knows?" she thought. "Maybe the left would be lucky after all. Later." "Do you think the EOC will still be functioning?" he asked, without looking back at her. "I don't know," she said. "But it's worth going there, right?" "I think it is," she said. "Honestly, Jim, I don't know anywhere else to go." "Okay," he said. He nodded gravely, and they paddled on. They'd gotten used to the sight of bodies floating in the water. By that afternoon, they'd seen literally hundreds of them. They were everywhere. And so, when Eleanor saw the body of the black man caught up in the limbs of a fallen tree, she paid him little mind. He was just another corpse, heavy-set, his clothes stripped from his body by high winds and water and debris, so that all that remained on his bloated frame was a filthy pair of briefs. He hung face down from the tree limbs, his arms swinging lazily in the current. There were cuts and sores all over his arms and back, and he smelled of rotten meat. To Eleanor, he looked just like every other dead body she'd seen. She looked away. Off to her right was a wide, glassy sea of pewter-colored water, broken only by a line of trees and a white metal roof in the distance. The sky was a washed-out gray. Eleanor could see dark vertical streaks of rain beyond the white roof, but with the absence of a breeze, it was impossible to tell if the rain was coming their way or not. It looked depthless and utterly still over there, as if the rain was just hanging in the air. There were structures to the left, and they seemed familiar. An AutoZone, a Mexican meat market, a CVS pharmacy, all of them veering off at a 45-degree angle from Eleanor's position. Wooden power line poles tilted at odd angles, their cables sagging near to the water, and from the ragged line they made, she thought she had a pretty good idea of where they were. "We need to head down that road there," she said, and immediately realized how stupid she sounded. "That way, I mean, where the road used to be." But Jim didn't tease her. He just grunted and said, "Okay," and paddled on. "He must really be tired," Eleanor thought. "Poor guy hasn't gotten any—" Eleanor wasn't aware the black man in the tree was moving until he was already on them. She heard a rustle of leaves, the snap of tree limbs, a splash as he hit the water and tried to scramble over the side of the canoe. Water hit her in the face, and she flinched, turning away from it. When she looked back again, she was staring straight down into a corpse's face. The eyes were filmed over, a milky white. His skin had a gray, flabby appearance, as if it might slough right off the bone. His lips were cracked open, the teeth shattered and black with blood. And it really was a corpse's face. There was no getting around that. She had locked eyes with him for only a second, but that was enough. She was sure of what she had seen. And she had just enough time to realize that she had been sure about Bobby Hester, too. And Ms. Hester. They were all corpses. The black man groaned as he shot out of the water and into the canoe, his hands going all over Madison, whose screams were so loud they felt like ice picks jammed into Eleanor's ears. Madison kicked him in the face, the heel of her tennis shoes smashing into the man's mouth. Eleanor could hear his teeth snapping. She could see blood spurting across his face. And yet the man made no attempt to block her kicks. He didn't seem to realize how badly his face was getting damaged. Instead, he just kept swiping at her, rocking the canoe wildly from side to side. Eleanor tried to grab Madison and pull her back, but they were moving too much, pitching all over the place. She felt the boat rise beneath her, tilting, to one side, and she instinctively clamped a hand down on the gunwale to steady herself as the boat rolled over, tossing her headlong into the water. She popped up immediately and looked around. Jim was up at the bow, at the far end of the canoe from her. Eleanor saw him surface, swipe the water from his eyes, and spin around looking for her. She couldn't see Madison anywhere. The cannibal, for that was what he must be, Eleanor realized, one of those cannibals, was still on his feet, though, and he was looking right at her. "Madison!" Eleanor yelled. "Madison, where are you?" She spun around wildly. She caught sight of Jim digging frantically at the water, but an impulse told her that he had no idea where Madison was either. "Madison! Madison!" The cannibal growled. The next instant he was trying to climb over the capsized canoe in order to get at Eleanor, but the hull was slick with the oily floodwater, and he slid off to one side. He tried again to scale over, and again he fell off. He was closer now to her end of the canoe, less than an arm's length, really, and yet he tried a third time to climb over the capsized canoe. "Why doesn't he just go around?" she thought. And somewhere in the back of her mind something clicked. She had asked exactly the right question. Not, "What in the hell's wrong with him?" but, "Why doesn't he just go around?" One step to the side, and he could be right there in front of her. And yet he didn't see it. He didn't see the obvious. Why? But the next instant the question was moot, for the stern of the boat tilted under the water, pushed down by his weight, and when he slipped off this time, he was right in front of her, nothing between them. He charged her. "Get Madison out of here!" Eleanor shouted at Jim as the cannibal fell on top of her. She could smell the putrescence on his breath. She could feel the rubbery give of the flesh on his arms as she wrestled with him, holding him at arm's length so he couldn't bite her. He was a lot bigger than Eleanor, but he was clumsy, his movements uncoordinated, and she managed to toss him to one side. As the man went under the water, Eleanor's muscle memory and training took over. At the police academy, the instructors preached the gunfighter's gospel. Break contact, create distance, get your front sight on the target. So she scrambled away from him, making sure not to lose sight of him, and reached down to her hip for her gun. But it wasn't there. "Where is it?" The thought hung unanswered in her mind as a panicky wave of nausea filled her gut. And then, with an inward groan, she remembered. The gun had been digging into her ribs as she paddled the canoe. Despite the threat of cannibals, despite the tired but insistent voice in her head that told her she was making a mistake, she had slid the weapon from the waistband of her jeans and dropped it into the front pocket of her backpack, along with all her extra magazines. "Where it would be close," she thought bitterly, "just in case I need it." Now the backpacks were floating away from the canoe, carried by the sluggish current toward the line of bushes in front of the CVS pharmacy. There was no way she could reach them now. The cannibal had his hands out in front of him, clutching at the air. The growl was gone. The sound crawling out of his mouth now was an urgent, pitiful moan. The first 2 fingers on his right hand were bent back, obviously and horribly broken. As his other fingers reached for her, the 2 bent back ones hardly moved. All they could manage was a feeble twitching. She had been backing away from the man, cowering really, but then her foot hit something hard under the water. It was like a gunshot going off in her mind. Suddenly everything was clear. The cannibal lunged for her, almost diving. She stepped nimbly to one side, and the man found himself face down in the water. He seemed momentarily confused by this, as though he was unable to process why his victim had suddenly disappeared, and under different circumstances, the way his face went slack and his mouth fell open would have been comical. But for now she was all business. Eleanor immediately jumped onto the man's back, got a knee planted firmly between his shoulder blades, grabbed his hair with both hands, and pushed his face under the water. He began to thrash. His arms splashed frantically, though clumsily, at the water, like a man who thinks he's a bird and might be able to fly away if he just flapped hard enough. She could feel his legs kicking against hers, his upper body convulsing as he gulped in water instead of air. "Drown, you asshole!" she growled. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Jim looking at her. Without letting go of the cannibal, she met Jim's gaze. His face was a mask of horror and shock and helpless confusion. She couldn't help but wonder what it must be like to be in his shoes right now, watching his wife intentionally drown a man, while she snarled at him like an animal. The cannibal spasmed once, twice, and then he went slack beneath her. She slid her knee off the man's back, but didn't let go of his hair. "Eleanor," Jim said. There was a curious sympathy in his voice. She glanced at Jim again. "He's dead," Jim said. She looked down at the dark crown of hair just below the surface, saw the strands of it weaving like seaweed between her fingers. Her knuckles were white. The muscles in her forearms were tensed so tightly they hurt, and she had to will herself to release her grip on the back of the man's head. "Madison," she thought, and that did it for her. She pushed the cannibal's corpse away and said, "Where's Madison?" Suddenly Jim was at her side, his arms around her. She struggled against him, still screaming her daughter's name, when he finally grabbed her shoulders and spun her around to face him. "She's here," he said quietly, over and over again. "She's right here." "Where?" He stepped away from Eleanor and slapped the hull of the capsized canoe. "It's okay, Madison. You can come out now." Delicate fingers curled up and around the gunwale, and the next instant Madison's head popped up from under the canoe. A gasp leaked out of Eleanor's throat that was part laugh, part absolute relief and joy. "Oh, my God!" she managed to say, and then rushed for her daughter and wrapped her arms around her in a hug so tight it took both their breath away. "Oh, my God!" she said again. "Madison, I thought... Oh, thank God you're safe." "Mom," Madison said. Her tone was full of protest, but she didn't make any attempt to pull away. Eleanor released her grip and held Madison away at arm's length. "Are you okay, sweetheart? He didn't hurt you, did he?" Madison shook her head, no. "I'm okay," she said. "Oh, thank God." Eleanor closed her eyes and let out a long sigh of relief. Her mind had been filled with such horrible thoughts of what that man might have done to her, and the fact that he'd had no time to do anything to her made little difference. "We invent such nasty fates for the ones we really love," Eleanor thought. "Why is that? Why do we punish ourselves so much?" The clatter of a metal fence brought her back to the moment. She turned around and scanned the flooded ruins. About 100 feet away, a man was trying to pull his battered body over a chain-link fence, and Eleanor realized with a withering sort of horror that the man was a cannibal, like the one she'd just drowned. He wore the remnants of a blue chambray shirt and khaki trousers that were flecked with green leaves and stained a reddish-brown in places. It was blood, she realized coldly. And looking at his face, she could see that he had fed recently. His chin and cheeks and hair were slathered with clotted blood. Even at a distance she could see that one eye had been gouged out. He poked his fingers through the diamond-shaped holes in the fence and started to climb. His movements were awkward and labored, but it only took him a few moments to reach the top, and when he did, he let out a moan that sent shivers down Eleanor's back. The sound carried over the water. There was a chilling rhythm to it, like the steady rise and fall of a large crowd heard from a distance. And then, from off to her right, she heard an answering moan. She turned and saw 3 more human train wrecks, up to their waists in water, shambling toward her. A short distance from them, the figure of a woman emerged from the broken windows of a storefront, her bruised face turning slowly until she zeroed in on Eleanor. "There's more of them over here," Jim said. Eleanor didn't have to ask where. They were surrounded. The late afternoon air was filling up with an almost desperate chorus of moans, and Eleanor realized with deepening despair and fear that they were calling to each other. "They're ringing the dinner bell," she thought. "We need to do something quick," Jim said. "Into the boat," Eleanor answered him. "Everybody into the canoe." Hurriedly, they righted the canoe, and Madison and Eleanor climbed in. Jim grabbed the short rope they'd tied to the stem post on the bow and pulled them along. The oars had floated along with the current, headed in the same direction as the backpacks, and when Jim reached the first of them, he scooped it up and tossed it back to Eleanor. The moaning cannibals were all around them now, emerging from nearly every yawning doorway and from behind every building. Eleanor turned around on her seat, scanning the ruins in utter dismay. Where had they all come from? The area had been completely deserted just moments before, and now they were everywhere. Had all this really stemmed from that one man moaning as he scaled the fence? Was such a thing possible? Briefly, a memory surfaced in her mind. She'd been a young patrol officer at the time, working nights in Houston's 5th Ward. One blisteringly hot summer night, while on routine patrol, she'd rounded a corner and seen a group of 3 teenagers arguing on the curb. Their voices were loud, but indistinct. She couldn't make out what was said, only the anger with which the words were yelled. Then suddenly, one of the boys had taken 2 lurching stagger steps backward, his hands flying up in front of his face. As he turned away, there was a flash and the sound of 3 gunshots. He stumbled into the street, bent over, and collapsed not 20 feet from her front bumper. The 2 boys on the curb stared at her, their eyes huge in the glare of her patrol car's spotlights. One of them raised his pistol at her, but the other was already turning to run. He grabbed his friend by the shirt and pulled him after him. By the time Eleanor got her car in park and scrambled out of it, the 2 were already gone. And the 3rd young man was dying. She knelt down next to him and tried to talk to him, but all he could do was gulp air like a fish out of water. He died right there, on the pavement, as she was calling for EMS and backup. But it was what happened afterwards that came to her mind now. For when she'd looked up from the dead boy's blood-spattered face, she'd seen that the sidewalks on both sides of the street were filling with people. They watched her, their expressions impassive, unmoved by the tragedy in front of them. And as her gaze shifted from one to the next, she thought, "It's the middle of the night. Where did all you folks come from? How did it happen? The street was deserted just a moment ago. Where did you all come from?" There was, she guessed, a certain magnetic quality to violence. People flocked to it like moths to a bare electric bulb. They fed off it somehow, even as it drained some vital quality from their souls and dulled their senses. Maybe that was what was happening here, she thought, as she watched the cannibals closing in on them. "Jim, get on the boat! Hurry!" The moaning crowd was getting ever closer. The man in the blue chambray shirt had made it over the chain-link fence and was less than 30 feet away now. Close enough she could smell him. "Hurry!" she said again. But Jim had found the other oar and was already pulling himself into the canoe. He dropped down onto the seat, and without another word, he dug into the water with his oar, really stabbing at it. Eleanor joined him, and they moved off at a snail's pace, following the current. Ahead of them was what had been a wide 4-lane road. It was full of people now, all of them splashing as fast as they were able toward the little canoe. Eleanor saw a new U-shaped building off to their right. It looked to be 2 stories high, glass all the way around, encircled by a wraparound balcony. An office park, she thought. This part of town had been on the rebound before the storms. A lot of new development in the area. "Take us over there to the right," Eleanor said. "Where?" Jim asked, looking around at her. "Over there." "What are you thinking?" he asked her. "Look at the light poles. The water looks deeper over there. They'll have to swim to follow us." "Got it," he said. They paddled toward the building, but they were going across the current now, and their progress was slower. The cannibal in the blue chambray shirt was nearly on them now. Another 4 or 5 steps, and he'd be close enough to topple the boat. "Mommy!" Madison screamed, and flinched away from the man. Her movement set the canoe rocking wildly, and Eleanor had to grab her by the arm hard to settle the canoe. At the same time she raised her oar over her head and brought it down hard on the cannibal's outstretched hand. The oar connected with his knuckles with a crunch of bone, but the man never cried out. Instead, he turned slowly to Eleanor and tilted his bloody face to one side. Then, with his other hand, he reached out for her. Eleanor raised the oar again, but before she could bring it down, the man's head burst open, and bits of bone and skin and lumps of his scalp splattered onto the water beside him. Eleanor blinked at him. For a second, her mind wouldn't wrap around what had just happened. The cannibal, for his part, seemed unaware he'd just been killed. His face never changed expression. The bloody grimace that had turned his mouth into such an object of horror never relaxed. With no emotion of any kind, he slowly sank into the water, like a marionette whose strings had just been cut. Confused, Eleanor looked at Jim, but he was clearly as confused as she was. "What happened?" he said. Her gaze went past him, fixing on a figure who was standing on the wraparound balcony of the office park. He was waving at them, a rifle in his hands. "Is that?" Jim asked. "Yeah," Eleanor said, a smile creeping across her face as she took in the wiry country boy with the boonie cap pushed high up on his forehead, away from his sunglasses. "That's Hank Gleason." Chapter 11. The water was deeper around the building, which Eleanor could see from a cream-colored granite wall near the entrance to the parking lot, was called the Meadow Lakes Business Park. Eleanor looked down as they entered the lake that had once been the building's parking lot, and though the water was a dark gray and cloudy with silt and debris, she could still see the ghosts of cars down there. She chanced to look behind her. The crowd that had been closing in on them was struggling with the deeper water. Many were drowning as they tried to follow them, but there were many more gathering beyond the entrance, maybe 100 total now, and their moans had become truly awful, rising to a deafening roar that seemed to echo off every building at once. "Why won't they leave us alone?" Madison screamed, Leave us alone!" Eleanor turned back to her daughter, and saw that Madison's face had turned an ashen white. Her eyes were wide, crazy-looking, shiny and bloodshot. Beads of sweat had popped out all over her face, and the green T-shirt she wore was dark and wet at the neck and underarms. Her expression was one of utter despair and rage and exhaustion. "Madison," Eleanor said. Her voice was firm, but not without compassion. "Baby, look at me." Madison's gaze shifted from the drowning cannibals to Eleanor, and in that instant Eleanor's heart broke. "Mom, what's wrong with them? Why are they like that?" Suddenly Eleanor felt very tired. Her eyes had gone dry, and they hurt. It wasn't a needling pain, but the kind of soreness that came from too many hours of staying awake, heartsick with worry about life and family and the future. She pinched the bridge of her nose between her thumb and forefinger and let out a long, tired sigh. "They're desperate," Eleanor said at last. "Desperate people do terrible things." "Miss Hester wasn't desperate," Madison countered. She had that defensive, challenging tone that all teenagers seem to fall back on when the world of grown-ups stops making sense. "She had us. We were family. We loved her. I loved her. Why did she change? Why did she turn into one of those crazy people?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but closed it again. She had nothing, no answer that would do her daughter's question justice, and she knew it. There were times, she thought, when she got the teenager's point of view. It wasn't that long ago, for Christ's sake. But Madison was still looking at her with that look that was simultaneously defiant and wounded. And the truth was, Eleanor told herself, that she wasn't even sure she had been telling the truth when she called those cannibals over there desperate. Madison was right about that. Miss Hester hadn't been desperate. She'd been attacked by her grandson, attacked so badly that, for a second, Eleanor thought he had killed her. And then she became just like him. Had something similar happened for each of those people at the edge of the parking lot? Did they have a Bobby Hester somewhere behind them, a crazed loved one who attacked them and changed them? She just didn't know, but the possibility terrified her. They could be sitting at ground zero of an epidemic. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to push the image of Miss Hester crawling across the floor of Madison's room out of her mind. But she couldn't. She could still hear Miss Hester's fingernails snapping as her claw-like hands gripped the carpet. She could still see the woman's face, blood-stained and twisted with an expression that wasn't quite rage, not quite pain, but something that was both of those things, and neither. "Hey there, Sergeant Norton. How you doing?" Eleanor glanced up at the balcony. Hank Gleason was up there, smiling down at them with that cool country boy swagger of his, smoking a cigarette, and a momentary blush rose up in Eleanor's cheeks. A 16-year-old memory surfaced along with it. It had happened before Madison was born, even before Jim had entered her life. She had gone to see the Twilight Saga Eclipse with two of her girlfriends from the department. They'd sat there in the darkened theater feeling stupid, feeling like the only adults in a room full of teeny boppers, until the werewolf, Jacob Black, made his first appearance. Jacob was leaning against the trunk of a car, no shirt to hide the view, six-pack abs shiny with a thin sheen of sweat, and the entire audience, 300 women in all, let out a collective, satisfied sigh. Eleanor and her girlfriends held Hank Gleason in similar esteem. Like Taylor Lautner, who had played Jacob in Eclipse, Hank was pure eye candy. But whereas Taylor Lautner, a.k.a. Shark Boy, was really just a child growing into a man's body, Hank was the real deal. He was a man in a god's body, He was a 6'4" monument to good genetics, for only perfect genes could account for a man who drank like an Irish poet and smoked like a barn on fire, and yet still managed to look like an underwear model. He'd been in the sun a lot these last 2 weeks, too. She could tell from the faint red glow of his skin, set off by the gold-rimmed aviator sunglasses and the OD green T-shirt he wore. The added color made him look even more delicious. Eleanor cleared her throat. "We're doing just fine, Hank. Thanks for the help back there." He took a last drag on his cigarette and crushed it out beneath the toe of his boot. "Always happy to help out a lady in need," he said, tipping his boonie cap jauntily at her. He looked over at Jim and said, "How about you, Mr. Norton? You doing okay?" "Just great, thanks. Call me Jim." Hank's smile grew bigger, even warmer if that was possible. He had lovely teeth. "You got it, Jim. Call me Hank. And you, little lady," he said to Madison, "how goes it?" Madison tried to smile, but couldn't muster a very convincing one. Hank's smile wavered a bit, but to his credit he didn't push it. "Y'all had a rough ride, I guess," he said. "Yeah," Eleanor agreed. "You could say that." "Well, we got it pretty well covered up here. Water's deep enough they can't get to us, and even if they did, we got the only stairs blocked off." He pointed down the length of the building, where a large metal staircase was completely buried in a tangle of pipes and cables and all sorts of heavy debris. On the balcony above the stairs, Eleanor saw about 10 metal-hulled canoes. "I was watching when you guys first showed up," Hank went on. "I saw you flip over and lose your backpacks. They're still stuck over there along that line of shrubs. I can help you get 'em back tomorrow morning if you want. In the meantime, we got a bunch of supplies up here if you guys want to spend the night." "Who's we?" Eleanor asked. "Me and about 30 old geezers from the Red Cross. Volunteers, you know. Good folks. They had a ton of supplies with them when I found them. Come on up." Eleanor looked over at Jim. "I don't see that we've got any other choice," he said. "Yeah, I agree. Madison, this would be a good chance for you to get some rest. I know you had a really crappy day." Madison nodded. She looked up at Hank and was about to ask him how they were supposed to get up there, but he was already lowering a rope. Hank pulled them up by the rope one by one, and then helped them stow their canoe with the others. With the boat secured, he pointed them down the balcony. "We're this way. You guys hungry?" "God, yes," Jim said. Jim was drenched in sweat, sunburned, exhausted. He had an arm around Madison's shoulder. His lips were cracked and pale, his face scruffy with a week's worth of whiskers. Eleanor looked at him, and then at Hank Gleason, who was walking next to him, resplendent in his testosterone-laden maleness. And there was no comparison. Jim was your standard American male, a little dopey-looking, soft around the middle, full of flaws. But Hank was the ideal. He was tall and lean, with muscles so hard you could bounce quarters off them. And yet, now that she had the two of them before her, Eleanor realized why she had fallen in love in the first place. Hank just bled into the background. For her, it was all about Jim. The sight of him hobbling along, sweaty, balding, kind of chubby, stiff from sitting in the canoe all day, but with his arm draped around their daughter, was enough to melt her inside. For her, that was real love. "What?" Jim said. He was looking at her, a hint of a laugh in his voice. "Nothing," she said. "I'm hungry, too." Hank Gleason clapped his hands. "Outstanding. After a day of dodging zombies, I guess you guys are ready for some serious chow." He spoke casually. There was even a breezy note of humor in what Hank had said. But it still sent a chill through Eleanor. They had been walking along the balcony, a long line of dark and empty office space to their left, and to their right, a misty sort of rain falling on the flooded city. The air had a briny ocean smell. Eleanor, who was beginning to sense the mother bitch of all headaches coming on, had been trailing along behind, trying to relax. But her mind rebelled to the idea of zombies, and she stopped in her tracks. "What did you say?" The others walked on a few steps, unaware that she was no longer following. Hank looked back at her over his shoulder, and stopped walking too. He was still smiling, but the expression had lost some of its easy charm. He looked like a man just beginning to realize he'd said something wrong. I'm sorry, ma'am? You called those people zombies. Those cannibals. Yeah? Zombies? Like in the horror movies? The Walking Dead. Well... He trailed off, and abruptly he looked very uncomfortable. He glanced over at Jim, maybe for support, and Eleanor could see the Adam's apple working up and down in his throat. "Well, I mean," he went on, "they're not actually, dead, but... Yeah, I mean, they're zombies. I mean, isn't that what you guys saw?" "Of course not, you idiot," Eleanor thought. Adonis though he may be, she'd never held any delusions about Hank Gleason's good genetics extending all the way up to his brain. "Zombies? Seriously? People are eating each other out there. People are dying. Miss Hester is dying. And you're making jokes about zombies? This shit is for real." "But doesn't that one word make a lot of sense?" asked a tentative voice in her head. Eleanor thought back to the horror movies she'd seen when she still watched garbage like that. Jim, of course, loved his horror movies. Always had. But Eleanor, who had seen real monsters, who, during her tour of duty in sex crimes, had seen more murdered children than any normal person should have to see, was unimpressed by Hollywood's trivial attempts at fear-making. Their monsters paled in comparison to the real-life horrors that walked the streets of every city in America and hunted its children like trophies. In her mind, zombies were nothing but harlequins, clowns in shabby makeup. They staggered around, pantomiming death, while cheesy music played on the soundtrack and bare-breasted bimbos titillated the teenage boys in the audience. From her youth she remembered the movie version of Max Brooks's World War Z and the TV series based on Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead, and she remembered those grossing her out, but never scaring her. They were ridiculous. They were slow and stupid and little more than an excuse for a whole generation of angry-minded, disaffected youth to safely and sanely fantasize about killing loads of people. Zombies were wish fulfillment, nothing more. "But doesn't that one word make a lot of sense?" repeated the faint, tentative voice in her head. Only now it was less tentative, gaining strength. "Doesn't it?" Eleanor glanced out across the water. A misting rain was still falling. The water coursed slowly as it pushed, finger-like, into the low places between the buildings, and here and there dark shapes moved at the edges of the parking lot, their moans echoing across the flood. She turned back to Hank. He was looking at her, that uncertain grin still on his face. Beside him, a head shorter and looking utterly bedraggled, Jim was also watching her. She stared back at Jim and wondered if his mind was having the same trouble linking up what they had seen with the word zombie and all it implied. It didn't seem so. He, and Madison beside him, looked unruffled by the use of the word. It had no power over them, not in the same way it did over her. "But they're alive," she said. "Out there when I—" She was about to say, "when I drowned that man over there," but the words wouldn't come. The memory of her own anger, and the look of disgust and worry, and the fear she had seen on Jim's face afterward, crowded into her mind.
"They're not dead," she said.
"No," Frank said slowly.
"No, they're alive all right." "So how can they be zombies?"
"Well, I don't mean zombies like in Night of the Living Dead and stuff like that. You're right about them being alive. Those aren't corpses. But the rest of it fits, doesn't it?"
Again he looked at Jim, who nodded readily enough. He does believe it, Eleanor thought. He and Madison, too. They're both buying this. You've seen the way they stagger around, the way they moan. You can't reason with them. They don't even seem to hear you. They don't seem to feel any pain. I watched one of them walking around with his intestines hanging out of his belly. And I mean they're, eating each other. What else could they be?"
Yeah, she thought, remembering the look she had seen in Bobby Hester's eyes, and all that had come after that.
"What else could they be? I don't know," she said at last. "I just don't know."
Hank took them inside, where the Red Cross volunteers had set up a temporary shelter. There was no electrical power, of course, and the room was poorly lit by a single candle burning on a makeshift desk against the wall to the left of the door. Almost as soon as she entered, Eleanor recoiled, not only from the smell of 30 people who had been living together in close quarters without air conditioning, without bathing, without washing their clothes in days, but from the way their eyes had seemed to glow with a pale reflected light when they all turned as one to look at the new arrivals. "It's all right," Hank said. "We don't bite." She gave him a caustic look, but the poor man was too dumb to realize he'd made a poor choice of words. Jim and Madison didn't hesitate, though. They followed Hank inside and smiled and muttered thank you as he introduced them around. Eventually, Eleanor followed, too. The glowing eyes she'd seen upon entering the room were gone now. They'd been replaced with worn, exhausted, but kind and smiling faces. Hank had been right out there on the balcony when he referred to these folks as geezers, Eleanor thought. Not a single one of the volunteers looked to be under 65. She spotted several older women playing bridge on an old army cot. The women smiled at her, and especially at Madison, and Eleanor pushed down renewed thoughts of the thing that Miss Hester had turned into. But, she realized, Miss Hester was another point in favor of Hank's theory that the cannibals out there were zombies. Their bites are contagious, just like in the movies. She shook the thought away, and instead turned to Hank. "How did you find these people?" she asked. He beamed at her. "I just got lucky, I guess. Captain Shaw sent me out night before last to find anybody I could and bring 'em back to the EOC. These folks here, they was set up in the gym over at the Elgin T. Baker Elementary School. They had the place all ready for the refugees. Food, medical supplies, bunk beds, board games, you name it. They were ready." "Well," said Eleanor, glancing around, "where are the refugees?" "Nobody ever showed," he said, and shrugged like it was no big deal. "Who knows why? It's a shame, too, with all the supplies they had. I guess it's just another one of those screw-ups that always seem to happen during times like this, you know?" "Yeah," she said. "Just another one of those screw-ups," she thought bitterly. It made her wonder, when this was all said and done, just how much of the city's disaster mitigation efforts would be summed up by those words. They were living through the greatest natural disaster since the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and yet, despite all their training, all their drills, and FEMA classes and grant money, they were bumbling around like idiots, humbled by the reality of nature. "Hey, but it's all right," that voice inside her head said. Only now the voice was anything but tentative. It was full-on sarcastic, laced with meanness. "It's just another one of those screw-ups, ain't that right?" "Yeah,"
she thought. That's right.
"Sarge," Hank said, "you okay?"
"Huh?" Eleanor asked. "Oh, yeah, I'm fine. I was just thinking." "Go on, you were saying?"
Yeah, well, so when I get to the school, the area around it is pretty much hip-deep in water. The neighborhood, I mean, all the houses and stuff. I'm motoring down this street in a ski boat, and at the end of it I see a playground and soccer goals. But the school itself is up on this hill, dry as a bone.
"How'd you find out there were people inside?" Eleanor asked.
I knew something was up. I could smell those zombies, you know. You know the way those zombies stink?
"You could smell them? You didn't hear them moaning?"
Not at first. I heard 'em later, but the first thing I noticed was the smell. It's that set-in dead guy smell, like a really bad decomp. You smelled that before. You know what I mean."
Eleanor nodded.
You ever smelled a body that's been rotting inside an apartment with no air conditioning in the middle of summer for 3 weeks?
Hank asked Jim. Jim shook his head. He looked amused by Hank's easy manner, even as his nose wrinkled at the thought of a rotting corpse, and Eleanor realized that this was why Hank was so popular at work. Everybody loved him because he made them feel as if they were the center of the world.
"I remember this one time," Hank went on. "A bunch of years ago, I got this call for a suicide. I could smell it from the street when I pulled up, and I knew what I was going to find even before I got out of the car. You just get that feeling that it's going to be a bad one, you know? So my partner and I went up to the house and got inside, and there was this big, fat dude hanging from his bedroom ceiling. He'd been there long enough for the rope to stretch his neck out like one of those African tribes in the National Geographic, you know the ones?"
Jim nodded.
"The guy was so fat, the contract body removal guys had to hold him by the legs while the firefighters cut the rope up near the ceiling. Of course, he was bare-ass naked, too. Man, you should have seen it. When the body dropped, it sagged over the shoulder of one of the body removal guys like a bag of flour. And when that happened, all that decomp gas and the guy's rotten guts shot straight out of his ass. It sprayed the wall behind him, and, oh, man, did it smell! You should have seen us, grown men, veteran cops and firefighters and morgue employees. We all went running out into the front yard. And, of course, it was a slow news night. Channel 13 was right there with a camera crew. They got a great shot of us puking our guts out."
Jim looked as if he couldn't make up his mind to laugh or vomit. Hank, of course, was laughing at his own story, his face turning red. His laughter was contagious, though, and Eleanor, despite everything on her mind, found herself laughing along with him.
"Cop humor," she thought. "God, we are a screwed-up bunch of folks." "Anyway," Hank said, after the laughter had died down, "I thought that was about the worst stink I'd ever smelled in my life. Until I ran into the zombies around that school, that is."
"They stank that bad, even outside?" Eleanor asked.